Alright, so this is the first part of chapter 13, all about personality. Now, personality has historically been a construct that's kind of difficult to define, but if I were to ask you to describe a person to me, like one of your best friends, the things that you would say would probably be descriptive of their personality. So, if you were to pick a specific friend, just think about what characteristics they possess, how you would describe them to me. So you would probably talk about the behaviors that they like. So maybe what types of hobbies they have, what type of a sense of humor or a demeanor they possess, what type of mood they're generally in. Are they an especially friendly, open person, or are they kind of private, reclusive? Are they shy? Are they outgoing? These are all things that are considered to be aspects of personality. Now we'll go ahead and define personality as an individual's characteristic pattern of thinking, feeling, and acting. And so you can see that this really covers a lot of the basic aspects of the definition of psychology: thinking, feeling, and acting, behavior, and mental processes. So one thing that's a really defining characteristic about personality is that it's thought to be fairly consistent over time. So that means that people don't change drastically in their personalities from one day to the next, or 1 month to the next, or even 1 year to the next. There is some gradual change as we age, but most of that change happens in the earlier years, and then people's personalities really tend to stabilize once they reach adulthood. Now, personality is also thought to stay fairly consistent across situations. So somebody who is really outgoing and maybe likes to choose leadership roles when they're hanging out with their friends, likes to make decisions for the group, would also be expected to act in some similar ways when they are, let's say, in a classroom. So if they are assigned a group project, for example, they might very gladly take a leadership role on that and make decisions for that group. Now, in my class I cover a couple of different perspectives on personality. The one I'm going to focus on in this lecture is more the historic perspective, which Sigmund Freud provided. So we'll be looking at the psychoanalytic perspective today, and then in our next lecture, the second part of this chapter, we'll cover some perspectives that are more relevant to modern research on personality. So we'll look at trait theories and different trait measures like the Big Five, and then we'll also look at the social cognitive theories of personality, which suggests that our behavior is a little bit more dynamic in terms of social interaction. So someone's personality is really a product of the interaction between what's inside of them and the way that they're treated by other people. But as I said, for this lecture I just want to focus on the psychoanalytic perspective. So hopefully you know how to pronounce Sigmund Freud's name. As I've said, it's Sigmund Freud. I've seen some psychology majors who are juniors or seniors who have pronounced it Freud, which just makes me sad. But that's important to know. So Freud actually started off as a medical doctor, and for a long time, before psychology was really a field that was recognized as a science, physicians would see people who had mental problems and assume that that was due to some underlying physical cause, just like a traditional illness. But Freud had a different perspective on this. He thought that there might be psychological causes of some of these mental states that people were struggling with. So for example, if somebody had a lot of anxiety, Freud would say that, well, maybe that isn't necessarily due to any specific physical illness. Maybe it's due to something that is more a purely psychological phenomenon. So Freud was really interested in anxiety disorders. He worked a lot with people who were just very stressed out and suffering in that way. But as you'll see today, a lot of his work is really relevant to the study of personality. He really wanted to understand what made people the way that they are. And so a lot of his theory really centered on that, how these things that happen to us early in life shape the people we become as adults. Now, one thing that is really distinctive about Freud's theory is that he had this strong focus on the unconscious mind. So the notion is that we have a lot of these sexual and aggressive impulses that are buried deeply down inside of us, inside of our unconscious mind. And that we learn as we're growing up that a lot of these feelings are just unacceptable. They're not socially acceptable. And they wouldn't be acceptable. It wouldn't be acceptable for us to act on them either. And so, as our way of dealing with this, Freud said that what we do is we repress these unacceptable thoughts and feelings, which means that we push them down into our unconscious mind so that they are no longer really as disturbing on that conscious level. But Freud thought that even though these things had been repressed, they would still have a detectable influence on people's thoughts, feelings, and actions. So he thought that there would be all these conscious manifestations or outlets that if you look at people's behavior, you could see that it was really reflecting some of these repressed impulses. So he thought that dreams really strongly reflected some of these repressed types of things. The jokes that people would tell, or the things that people would find funny, that would be determined by these repressed needs and wishes. Slips of the tongue, that's one I'll show you a little video in just a second to illustrate that. But if you've ever heard of the concept of a Freudian slip, the idea is that there is this, there's what seems like a mistake that someone will make when they're speaking, but Freud would say it was actually motivated by this unconscious force. Then there's sublimation. That has to do more with when someone is being creative. So they're like making a painting or a sculpture, and what they create actually ends up reflecting some of their unconscious desires. And so it slips out in that way. And then finally, a lot of the symptoms of anxiety that people would have. Freud would say that, well, people have these feelings of being worried and scared because they're concerned that they will lose control of themselves, and that's going to lead them to be rejected or punished if they end up losing control over their base needs, their animalistic desires. All right, so now we're going to look at a clip. This is from one of my favorite movies of all time, National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation. In this clip, the main character, Clark W. Griswold, is out Christmas shopping for his wife, and he encounters this really attractive saleswoman, and he ends up really stumbling a lot and accidentally saying a lot of things that he's thinking but he's trying not to say. So the idea is that he has all of these unacceptable thoughts, this attraction to this woman who is not his wife, and he's trying to repress them, but they keep slipping out. So let's watch this.
Can I show you something?
I was just smiling. I was just browsing.
For your wife or your girlfriend?
What? What happened? Woof. I guess wouldn't be any... Oh. Wouldn't be the Christmas shopping season if the stores were any less hotter than they are. Whew, it is warm in here.
Well, you have your coat on.
Yes. Oh, do I? How did that happen?
Because it's cold out?
Yes. It is. It's a bit nipply out. I mean nippy out. What did I say? Nipple? There is a nip in the air, though.
All right. So, anyway, now that we've got that illustration of the Freudian slip down, let's go ahead and look in more detail at Freud's ideas regarding the structure of personality. So the metaphor that Freud used here was an iceberg. So he thought that just a little bit of the mind is working on this conscious level. So the things that we know that we're thinking about, that's just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to psychology. But there's all this stuff that's just buried down deep. that we don't really have easy access to, but it's still having a very powerful influence on our day-to-day behaviors and feelings and thoughts. So the first aspect of Freud's personality structure that we'll look at here is the id. So the id is the part of our mind that consists of our primal animalistic urges. Now, one thing that a lot of people don't know is that Freud was actually influenced by Charles Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection, which was relatively new back when Freud was coming up with this stuff. But it was making a lot of waves in the scientific community. And so, of course, a big part of that was so controversial was the notion that human beings are just another species of animal, and that we really have a lot more in common with our animal brethren than we might like to think. And so we have all of these deeply rooted urges, like to fight and to pursue sexual relationships that might not necessarily be things that we're able to act on in our society with all these rules and regulations and laws. And so the id is the part of the mind that tells us to just go ahead and do what feels good. It's just the animal that's inside all of us. Now, the next part of the mind that we'll look at is the superego. So the superego is sort of like the opposite of the id. It is your internalized rules and standards. So the idea is that as people grow up, they learn all of these rules and they integrate them into their psyche, into their mind. And so it's sort of like your internal police officer that says, no, don't do that. Don't act on that terrible impulse that you have. You should do what's right. Do the right thing instead. And so Freud actually thought that little kids, when they're first born, don't really have a superego yet, because they haven't learned the rules. They haven't been rewarded for doing the right thing and punished for doing the wrong thing. So they're really just all id, and they don't have the superego to provide that balance yet. Now, the last part of the mind that we'll look at here is the ego. So you might have heard this word in another context. You will hear people say that somebody has a big ego, and what that typically means is that they are really full of themselves. They think that they are really wonderful people, right? That they're the greatest. It might be a little narcissistic. And so the ego is just yourself, your conscious self. And the role of the ego is to find a balance between these conflicting demands of the id and the superego. So, as I said, the id is always telling us, go ahead, do what feels good. It works on what Freud called the pleasure principle. The superego, on the other hand, is constantly telling us to strive toward perfection. So, both of these can cause some anxiety because you can't be perfect all the time and always follow the rules. And also, you can't just do whatever you want all the time. So the ego just takes these two conflicting demands and says, all right, we've got to deal with reality. So what are we going to do to satisfy these needs as best we can? And so the ego would be the part of the mind that actually makes those decisions. So if you think about this, it really closely resembles something that you've probably seen on a lot of TV shows and movies and cartoons, which is the guy who has to make some decision, and he's got the little angel on one shoulder and the little devil on the other shoulder. So we've got Bruce Campbell in this example from one of his movies. So, of course, if we applied Freud's labels to this, the id would be like the little devil on your shoulder saying, go ahead, do it, do it. The superego would be like the little angel that says, no, you have to do the right thing and be honorable and perfect all the time. And then, of course, the ego would be the person in the middle that just has to go ahead and say, all right, what am I going to do? So hopefully that'll help you to remember that notion a little bit better. Now, as I said, Freud was also really interested in how personality develops. So he had this theory of personality development that suggested that people go through a number of these psychosexual stages. So his thinking was that we have this primal energy, these primal instincts, and that at different ages that energy, that kind of sexual energy, gets invested in different body parts. And so what you'll see is that once people reach a certain age, they tend to focus a lot of their attention and behavior on a particular body part. There are also conflicts that people have to overcome at these different stages. And Freud thought that if people didn't successfully overcome these conflicts, they would become fixated or mentally stuck in that stage. Now that didn't mean that they wouldn't truly grow up, it would just mean that they might have some problems as adults as a result of these unresolved childhood issues. So that's why if you look at like a classic Freudian therapy session, he would always start off, or the therapist would always start off asking these questions about someone's childhood, their relationship with their parents, any hard times or disturbing memories they have as a child, to try to get at some of these deeply rooted psychological events. Now, the first of Freud's stages is the oral stage. And his notion here is that that psychosexual energy is invested in the mouth. Right? And so if you look at kids who are in this oral stage, this is the first stage, it's during infancy, and there's a lot that they're doing with their mouths. That's pretty much all they do is they cry and they eat. And they're also teething, so they stick a lot of things in their mouths to comfort them. They're going around. You have to be kind of careful because sometimes they'll pick things up that they shouldn't put in their mouths and stick them in there anyway. But the conflict that Freud said that people had to overcome at this stage was the anxiety that came along with having to stop breastfeeding. So that was a major source of comfort for children, as well as their source of nutrition. And so being weaned off of their mother's breast can really be something that kids struggle with. Of course, it's hard for parents too. But Freud thought that if people didn't get past this conflict, then they would have an oral fixation. So they would still be trying to get pleasure from using their mouth. And this doesn't have anything to do with oral sex necessarily or anything like that. Freud would use this oral fixation idea to describe a lot of different things, like somebody who is a compulsive smoker, or somebody who overeats or talks too much, or bites their nails when they're nervous. The idea is that all of these things involve the mouth being used to relieve some stress. Now, the next stage is the anal stage. Right? And just like the oral one didn't necessarily have anything to do with oral sex, this doesn't have anything to do with anal sex, so don't be thinking along those lines. But the idea is that that instinctual psychosexual energy is now invested in a different body part, the anus. And Freud's idea here is that one big thing that a lot of kids have to deal with around this next age range for the anal stage is toilet training. And that's something that causes a lot of anxiety, having to learn how to control your body, to control your bladder and your bowels. And so he didn't necessarily think that somebody who had never successfully made it through this stage was never potty trained. But he did think that people could have what he called an anal fixation that would explain problems with self-control. So if someone is either overly controlling, they're like a control freak, they're just super organized, maybe something akin to obsessive-compulsive disorder where they're just obsessed with order. Or, on the opposite end of the spectrum, if someone's really sloppy and messy, that would be like a lack of properly developed control. So the overly controlled folks Freud referred to as anal retentive, and the sloppy people Freud referred to as anal expulsive. But supposedly they could both be explained by appealing to this problem in this childhood stage. Now this is actually one of the big criticisms of Freud, is that he could really just explain everything away. So regardless of whether someone's really messy or really neat, he could just say, oh, well, you must have had a problem at some point in your childhood. And we'll talk more about those types of criticisms in just a little bit. Now, the next stage is the phallic stage, and this one's probably the most controversial of all of Freud's stages. Of course, a lot of his work is pretty controversial. It ruffles a lot of feathers among modern psychologists. But the idea is that in this stage that psychosexual energy gets invested in the genitals. So you do see kids around this age maybe playing with their genitals a little bit, exploring. They're recognizing these new feelings. But one of the more controversial claims that Freud made was that at this age, children have some type of sexual desire toward their opposite sex parent. So the notion was that you hear a lot of little boys saying, "I want to marry mommy," and little girls saying, "I want to marry daddy." Now, of course, people get upset by the idea of saying that little kids have something similar to adult sexual impulses. Now, I don't necessarily think that that's what Freud was saying, because kids this age haven't gone through puberty, they haven't matured sexually yet. But Freud thought that there was still this psychosexual energy that was having an influence on behavior, that might have been directing people's attention in this way. And so he thought that if people got fixated in the phallic stage, they would experience what he referred to as an Oedipus complex. So this is named after this old Greek tragic play where this guy ends up having a sexual relationship with his mother, and it's really traumatic, of course, that type of incestuous idea. But he didn't necessarily think that people with an Oedipus complex would actually still be sexually attracted to their parents as adults. Incidentally, the female version of the Oedipus complex is called the Electra complex. But what he thought was that people would be looking for somebody to take care of them like their parent did. So that basically men would be looking for a romantic partner who was similar to their mother, and women would be looking for a romantic partner similar to their father. And that this would end up causing a lot of trouble in their relationships with other people. So that's what he would use to explain those types of relationship problems. He would also say that if somebody didn't get enough exposure to their opposite sex parent, or maybe didn't have a mother or father around, that this could lead to problems with gender identity. So there's actually a disorder that's recognized in the current version of the DSM, but they're changing it in the upcoming 5th version that's just about to come out. It's currently called gender identity disorder, but they're actually changing it to gender dysphoria. But this is when somebody has a gender identity that is different from their biological sex. So Freud would have thought that that was really more like a problem or a disorder, but of course that's kind of a controversial claim nowadays, because people who are transsexual don't believe that there's anything really wrong with them. So there has been this move to declassify that as a disorder. So let's see. After the phallic stage came the latent stage, and this is really the most boring of all of Freud's stages, that psychosexual energy isn't really invested in any particular body part. People's sexual impulses basically take a break at this time. And there's no challenge that has to be overcome. And then the final stage, the mature adulthood stage that people will eventually reach, according to Freud, is the genital stage, at which time people will have mature sexual interests. So Freud thought that the goal that people would have at this stage is to essentially get married and have kids. And this is another one that modern psychology regards with a little bit of skepticism. Now, you can again see the influence of Charles Darwin here, which, of course, evolutionary theory is all about reproduction and mating. But, of course, not everybody who is psychologically mature and healthy wants to just settle down and get married and have kids. So, but of course this is an old-fashioned type of theory, and it really reflects its time. Now, as I said, Freud thought that a lot of the problems that people would have psychologically as adults were linked to these repressed childhood experiences. And so he used a form of therapy called psychoanalysis to try to uncover these issues. Now, the goals of psychoanalysis are to try to reveal and resolve some of those unconscious conflicts. So maybe find out what fixations someone might have. Do they have an oral fixation, an anal fixation? Is there some issue with their id that they're worried about losing control because of some strong desire, and where does that desire ultimately come from? Ultimately his goal was kind of to alter people's personalities. So remember, he thought that these childhood experiences made us who we are, and that by going down deep into the mind and tinkering with these things, you could change the way that people think and act and feel. Now this is actually very different from modern views of personality that say that personality can't really be changed, it's stable, people are who they are. Right? So that's a big difference between the classic Freudian view and the more modern perspectives. Now, because these conflicts are unconscious, they're kind of difficult to discover. So Freud had a lot of interesting methods for revealing the unconscious. One of these was free association. So this is what you think of when you imagine this stereotypical therapy session, when somebody will lie down on a couch and get comfortable and just talk to their therapist, just let loose, and have this kind of stream of consciousness speech where people just say whatever comes into their mind. And the idea is that if people just keep talking without censoring what they're saying, or thinking too deeply about what they're saying, then eventually that unconscious mind will start to reveal itself. But it's up to the therapist to figure out, what is important in what this person is saying. Now, a slight variation of this that Freud's student Carl Jung had was cued association. So this is what you might be familiar with as the word response task, where I would say a word and you would have to say whatever pops into your mind when you hear that word. Like smile. What's the first word that pops into your mind? Death. What do you think of? Family. Work. Child. What comes into your mind when you hear these words? Again, people are supposed to respond to those without really thinking deeply about their response. So supposedly that would reflect their unconscious mind. Freud was also really interested in dream interpretation. Now, modern psychologists will sometimes use this as an icebreaker, but they don't really think that dreams have any symbolic meaning to the extent that Freud did. But Freud was interested in the latent content of dreams. And there are, of course, two types of content that psychologists discuss: manifest content and latent content. The manifest content is what you actually see in the dream. So if you describe the dream experience that you had to another person, you're describing the manifest content. But Freud thought that that really was only important in as much as it had these hidden meanings behind it. So he would find all of this symbolism, and he would say that things aren't really as they seem in dreams. And so he would try to really analyze people's dreams to figure out what was going on in their unconscious mind. Then the last psychoanalytic method that we'll talk about is projective tests. So Freud would use these, and later psychoanalysts would use these tests. I actually don't know if Freud used this, but there's the Rorschach inkblot test, and you might be familiar with this. So the way that this works is that the therapist will show one of these abstract inkblot images to a patient, and they're supposed to say what they see in this inkblot. Now, it's just an abstract image, so the idea is that people are projecting aspects of their personality and their unconscious mind into this when they make this interpretation. And so that would allow the therapist to then analyze those responses and get an idea of what might be going on in that person's unconscious mind. So it's interesting if you look at the descriptions that people will have. I mean, lots of people see lots of different things, and there are some supposedly standardized methods for coding what they say and making sense of the responses, but there is a lot of criticism of this type of test because interpretation is often very subjective, so it doesn't really fit in with modern, more scientifically valid methods of testing personality. Now, as I've kind of hinted at, Freud isn't really held in the highest regard by a lot of modern psychological scientists. One reason for this is that Sigmund Freud really offered a lot of after-the-fact explanations. So it's sort of like playing the lottery after the numbers have already been announced. You know the outcome. You know the problems that someone is experiencing, and then you go and look at their childhood lives, see what they remember from their youth, and then just try to draw some link between the two. So it really wasn't very scientific at all. With the proper scientific method, the researcher will come up with a prediction that is falsifiable, and then they will go out and collect data to see if, to test that prediction, to see if it holds up to the evidence. But Freud really didn't do that at all. But you have to keep in mind that this was before a real rigorous psychology of science had been developed. So Freud was really a pioneer in studying the mind and trying to explain personality and behavior and psychological disorders. So you don't want to judge him unfairly in that sense. So it's really important to consider Freud in context. He did make a lot of important advances that continue to have an impact on the field of psychology today. So we talked about some of his therapeutic techniques, and that basic method of having a one-on-one session between a therapist and a patient is still practiced by modern psychologists. There are some exceptions like group therapy, but people will still go into an office with a therapist, get comfortable, and talk about their problems. Right? It's just that the theories that the therapists use and the advice that they give isn't really based on what Freud was doing. But he, like I said, he did make an important contribution there. Also, the whole notion of unconscious processes. Whereas Freud was not the first person to come up with this idea, he really popularized it. And if you study psychology to any extent, then you'll see that there is a lot of research suggesting that there are things going on in the mind that are not part of our conscious awareness. So subliminal priming, subliminal stimulation, and then there are these types of memory like implicit memory, as opposed to explicit memory, where you know how to do something, but you don't really know how you learned that. You don't remember all the details. So there is a lot in the unconscious mind, and Freud was really, like I said, the first to push the study of this aspect of mental life. And then finally, as I've said a few times, Freud was really influenced by Darwin's theory. So some of the early psychologists did use Darwin's theory in their work, but that idea kind of fell by the wayside for a lot of the 20th century. And then toward the end, you saw this resurgence of evolutionary psychology, which was born out of another field, sociobiology, that one of my favorite scientists, E.O. Wilson, kind of founded. He coined that term, sociobiology. But this is really something that is very prominent in modern psychology, that psychologists are applying that evolutionary theory to understand a lot of aspects of people's mental lives and their behavior. So it is important to acknowledge that Freud was really, in a sense, ahead of his time here as well. So anyway, that's the end of this lecture, so I hope you found this helpful.